Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So here we have Flask, Vue and machine learning. So we're going to build a machine learning orientated Flask API and consume with the Vue front-end application. So this project will be a three-step process. First of all, we're going to create a new model using naive Bayes, and then we're going to build a Flask API utilizing the model that we create. And then finally, we'll build a Vue front-end application to consume the API. So here we'll consume the API by sending information to the API. That information will be used to consult or make new predictions on the model that we create, and then return a result to the front end. So I will go through two examples in this tutorial. And the first example, I'll take you through the whole process of building an API and the Vue front end. And then the second example, we'll build the model, and then I'll just take you through the modifications that's required in your API and your front end to get the second model working. So you may already have watched some of my other tutorials. Some of the content here will be similar, particularly the Vue front end application if you've been through any of those videos. So please use the timestamp index provided to navigate to parts of the tutorial that you're interested in or want to learn about. So I have taken that into consideration, the timeline, and I've tried to build the timeline ensuring that you can just move across utilizing existing knowledge. So as per normal, if you like the content, please subscribe. As I get more subscribers, I will generate much deeper, longer, more in-depth tutorials. So at the moment, any tutorial suggestions are welcome, so please leave any tutorial suggestions in the comments. So just a quick note before we start building our machine learning models. So I am using Jupyter Notebook, so if you want to go ahead and install that, just head over to jupyter.org and then select install and install for your particular operating system. Typically on a Windows machine, once you've installed, you can use the command Jupyter Notebook book, and then that will start the application. So that application will open in your browser, and then from here you can create a new project, assuming also that you've installed Python. So you will also need Python to get this working. So just head across again to the Python website, download and install Python, and then you should be ready to start. Okay, actually, you might not be quite ready to start. So once you've installed Python, you might need to pip install. Well, you will need to pip install scikit-learn. So these are all the packages that are installed. So go ahead and install pip install and then pandas in the command line, and then pip install. You also need the scikit-learn. So here I'm using 0.23.1. So those are two commands that you'll need to run. So like I said, pip install, and then two packages, pandas, and then also scikit-learn, sklearn. So you'll need to download and install those packages also to get this started. So I think actually now we are ready to start. Okay, so we've got Jupyter Notebooks running here. I'll just shape that up slightly. So what we're going to need to do is create a new notebook. So let's build a new model. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the data model set from sklearn. We're just going to import that in. So from sklearn, import dataset, and I'll run that. So that's going to give us access to some existing data sets. What we're going to use is the dataset called load wine. So we put that in and we run that. So this is a particular data set which includes around about 200 rows of data. Here we have a number of different features. So let's just print out the features. So we go ahead and print out the features, and you can see here that there are 13 features here. So these are all parameters or properties of wine that can be measured. So we go ahead and we print out the labels for this. So we're just exploring the data at this point. So you can see here that there's 3 labels associated to the wine. So in addition to having these properties here, the wine will also be classed as 0, 1 or 2. So that would indicate, I assume, the level of quality of wine, I presume, at this case. So the wine in this list is going to be classed as 0, 1 or 2. So when we classify our new predictions, they're going to be classified as either 0, 1 and 2. So I can't remember, or I can't tell you what is the best type of wine, 0 or 2, but hopefully you get the idea. So let's just have a look at the shape of our data. So data.shape, you can see here we've got 178 rows and 13 columns, so the 13 features. Okay, so that pretty much is our data. So if we want to have a look at the data, let's just see some of the data we have in our data set here. So you can see that this is the type of data that's stored. Okay, so that's the type of data. So we've explored the data set. Hopefully you've got a general grasp of what that is. If you're not too sure, what you can do is just utilize this and go into a new tab and go ahead and have a look at the data on the scikit-learn website, and it would give you some more information about the data. There are definitely plenty of other data sets available that you can explore. So finally, in the data set, we have a target. So if I print that out, you can see that earlier I mentioned that the wine is going to be classified as 0, 1 or 2. So each entry in the data set has a target which is 0, 1 or 2, representing class 0, 1 and 2. Okay, so let's now set up our data and build our model. So let's import the train test split so we can set up our data and build our model. So we import that in and I press run. So now let's create our data split. So train test split. So we got the wine data. So this is the actual data about the wine. We got the targets. So this is the target, the classification of this particular type of wine. And then we're using a test size of 0.3. So we're going to be utilizing 30% for testing. And then we're just utilizing random state 1. That will give you a consistent result to mine. Okay, so now we have that in place. Now let's bring in our algorithm. So let's just run that. So here you can see that we're using this naive Bayes algorithm. Okay, so we're using this Gaussian MB. So let's just run that. Now we can set up and prepare this algorithm so we can then move to the next stage of creating or fitting the data and then making some predictions. So we go ahead and do that. And now we go ahead and fit our data. Okay, so now what we can do is we can run a prediction on the test data. So we're using 30% of the data here for testing. So we go ahead and run that. And now let's go ahead and just check that. So what we can do is we can import metrics. So do that, and then we can use that to print out an accuracy for the test data on the model. So we run that, and you can see that we've got an accuracy of our test data 98.1, which is a fairly good result. Okay, so now we have that in place. We now have our model. So we're going to pick up that model so that we can utilize it in Flask and then make more predictions utilizing our front end. So we can send data to our back end, Flask. Flask will have this model and make the new predictions and then send the results to the front end, our Vue application, and then they will be seen on the screen. So we're going to need pandas for this. So we import pandas as PD. So you're going to need to make sure that's installed. So again, if you go to the command prompt and run a pip install pandas. So I run that, and now we're going to pick all this data. So I'm just going to save this. I don't know why I do this, but I just save it to the download area. Obviously, you can change this path if you want to. So here we're going to pick all the data. So this is basically taking the model that we created from the data, and it's putting it into a file that can then be utilized later. It's kind of a persistent way of storing the model. So we run that. So now there should be a new file in my download. So I just check that. You can't see it, but I can definitely see a new file has been created. So what we can do is we can just test to see if everything is working by unpickling the model. So we can do that utilizing this command here. So if I run that, that looks like it's working okay. Now let's remember, if we want to make a prediction, we're going to need 13 entries here, because if you remember back up here, there are 13 features in this data set to make a classification. So let's just run this. We're going to do model.predict and then just all ones. So there's 13 ones there. So I run that, and let's just print that result. So I put the prediction in this result variable. So I'm just going to run that variable now. So it's going to say class and then the result. So I'm going in this array here, and I'm just selecting the first item, and I run that, and you can see it now. It says class, and then 111111 has been predicted class 1 type of wine. There we go. So now everything is running. We've got now our model ready to run in Flask. So now we're going to go ahead and create a new Flask application. So I will apologize if I have run through this too quickly. This isn't really a machine learning course or tutorial, but if you do have any questions about any of this machine learning aspects, I have just tried to give you an overview of what's happening here. Hopefully you can follow this. Once you have a rough understanding, you could also change the type of algorithm you're using or change the data. Hopefully it makes sense. If it doesn't, please let me know, and maybe in future tutorials I'll provide more information or less information, however you need or want it. Okay, so that's the classification example or model generated. Now let's move on to building the Flask API. So the great thing about Flask, it's really lightweight. It won't take us long to build this very simple API. Again, we're not going to go into any great depth. We're simply going to build a very simple Flask API so that we can connect the Vue front end to it. So let's go ahead and do that. So for those who have not used Flask before, I'll just quickly breeze through how to set up and create a new Flask application. For those who are familiar with this, then please skip to the next section. So let's just create a new folder on the C drive. You can see I created a new folder called Flask. So I'm going to open up the CMD, the command prompt, the terminal, and I'm just going to navigate to that by typing in cd and then that folder location or folder path. So now I'm inside of this Flask. I'm going to build assuming you've got Python installed, of course, I'm going to run a virtual environment or create a virtual environment for this. So venv, venv. So I'm going to create a new folder called venv, and I'm going to create the virtual environment inside of that. So I run that. That might take a couple of seconds to build. And then once we've done that, we need to then activate the virtual environment. So we're working within the virtual environment. So go to scripts, and then inside of that, you've got activate. So activate that. And you can notice here that we've activated the virtual environment. And this venv indicates that we've done that. And we're now working within that virtual environment. So what we're going to do now inside of this virtual environment is we need to install Flask. And we're probably going to need some of the machine learning tools. So we'll go ahead and install scikit-learn and pandas again so that we can unpickle our model. So first up then, let's install Flask. So that's pretty simple. We'll just type in pip install and then Flask. So we'll get that installed. That might take a couple of seconds. So clear that. So we also want to install the scikit-learn. So we'll go ahead and install that. That might take a couple of seconds. And when that's finished, we'll also install pandas. So pip install pandas. So now it's time to actually build the Flask application. So I've gone ahead and I've opened up my code editor, created a new file called mlapi.py. And this is in the same folder as my virtual environment. So you can see the virtual environment folder there I created earlier. So it's actually outside of the folder. So it's just one file. And what I've also done is earlier, if we remember, we pickled a model and we put that in the downloads folder. I've now just copied and pasted that into the same folder as where my Flask application is, this Flask file here. So I've renamed that to wine.pickle. Okay, so I've gone ahead and put in the mandatory. So from Flask, import Flask, get app equals Flask, and then the name. And I've created a simple root to begin with, just slash, so the homepage. And then a simple function here called hello world. So it's just going to return hello world onto the page. And so that we can run our application, we've got if name equals main, app.run debug is true at the moment. So now we've got that in place, let's go ahead and set our application. So I go ahead and type in set Flask app equals name of the application. Mine's called machine learning API.py. So we set that, and now we can go ahead and run the server. So let's do a Flask run. Oh, typo there. So now we have all that in place, we can now run the server. So I type in Flask and then run. So that should start our server. You can see that it's running on the localhost 5000 port. So let's just go ahead in the browser, and you can see that I've already got it ready. You can see it says, oh, hello world in this case. Okay, so that's all up and running nicely. So as far as we're concerned, everything is working okay. So let's go ahead now and build our API. So we're going to be running our API and connecting a front end view, in this case, application to our API. Now that's going to be considered as external from the Flask application. So we're going to need to install core headers. Or cores. So let's go ahead and import that in. So we need to just stop this server. So in order for us to have external connectivity to this API, aka utilizing Vue in this case, which uses a different port, so it looks as though it's from a different network, we're going to need to install Flask cores, and that's going to allow connectivity from external sources to our API. So let's do a pip install and Flask cores. So let's just get the package installed. So now we have that available. So now we can go ahead and import that into our project. So we have from Flask cores, import cores, and the cross origin. So with that in place, we now can set this up. So underneath the app, we set cores equals cores app, and then configure our cores header to allow content type. Okay, so now that's allowed access, we can now set out this route and define it to allow external cross origin. So we also, underneath here at root, we include the cross origin. So now we have access to cross origin access to this function here via this URL. So we can point our Vue application, our front end application, to this API, which is going to be on the just slash. So next up, let's import our model. Let's get our model into this application. So we're going to need to pickle. So we're going to import pickle so that we can unpickle the pickle file that we generated. And then go ahead and actually get the file inside of our application. So model equals pickle.load. So we're using pickle.load and we're going to open the wine.pickle. So at the moment, this file is expected to be in the same directory as this file, as our main app file here. Of course, you can change this directory here if you want to. So again, the R for a relative path. Okay, so that's in place. So now we next need to think about maybe a new route actually for accessing this API. So we're going to leave this default route just for a home page. And now let's make a new route for our API. So we're going to consume this API at this path here. So /wine. So we're going to point our API to that. So that's going to be where we can access it. And we're going to be utilizing the method get. Two methods available, get and post, to send information across from our front end. So we're going to be utilizing get in this case. So let's make a new function. I'm going to call this predWine, prediction wine. And we're going to just make sure that when we run this, we have actually collected something from get. So that if there isn't anything collected from get from our front end, then this statement here is not going to run, else it will run. So what do we want to collect? Now, what we can do is we're going to collect everything that someone types into the front end, all of the wine data, so that we can make a prediction. So there's 13 parameters that we need to collect from the front end. Now, obviously, we can collect that and put that into an array if we wanted to. Here, I'm just providing an example, a simple example, so you can visually see what's happening. So you're going to type into the front end, when we build our Vue application, 13 different parameters based upon the type of wine that you're working with, for example. And these are all the different parameters. We're going to use those parameters to make a new prediction. So like I said, here I'm just showing you the fact that, so you can see what's going on. We could have made this a little bit more abstract and created an array, captured the get information into an array. By all means, go ahead and do that if you're comfortable with doing that. So once we've got that, we then need to make a new prediction. So here we're manually preparing our data. So we're going to take this data that someone's typed in, put it into this array here. We're going to call this final features. So it's going to be stored in final features. And then what we're going to do is then create a new prediction. So like I keep saying, this is just a manual way of doing it. Again, you can work with arrays to prepare this data. So we're taking this data now, and you can see that we're creating a new prediction on this data, and we're going to return that prediction to this variable called prediction. So the last thing that we need to do is just output that back. So we're going to JSONify that data and send it right back. And what we're going to send back is class and then the actual prediction. So actually, I'm just going to get rid of that because we don't need that. We're just going to send back the actual prediction. And remember, the prediction is going to be 0, 1, 2, and that correlated to the classes of the wine. So now we've got that in place, let's just make sure that we're utilizing and importing JSONify, and also we're utilizing request, so we're going to need to import that in also. So we add that in. So we've got Flask JSONify request, pickle to unpickle the file. We're using Flask cores. So we're using cores and cores origin, so that allows external activity. So we're going to take in a get request. We're going to put that into these variables. We're going to use those variables to generate this new array so that we can then create a new prediction. Then we're going to put that prediction in this variable and then send it right back to our Vue application. So that pretty much ends that. Let's just make sure I haven't got enough parentheses there. So that ends that off. So that really is it for our API here, our Flask API. So let's now go ahead and build our front end with Vue. So hopefully you've seen how easy it is to build an API with Flask Flask is really a lightweight package in comparison to something like Django, for example, which is a little bit more intensive to develop a similar application. So like I said, now let's go ahead and create our Vue front-end application. So inside of our Flask, well, where our Flask application is held here, let's go ahead and create a new folder. So I'm going to call that front end and open up a new Visual Studio Code window. And then from here, we're now going to install Vue. So again, if you've familiar with installing Vue, we're going to use the Vue CLI. If you're familiar with that or have it already ready, then please skip ahead to the next section. So if you're not familiar with utilizing Vue, completely new to Vue, then by all means go ahead to the Vue documentation and just run through the installation guide. I will quickly go through it, but here we're going to be utilizing the Vue CLI, so we're going to npm install that. To do that, we're going to need Node.js. So first of all, your first step, if you haven't already got it, is to install Node.js. So just head over to Google, type in Node.js. On Windows, it's really simple. It's just a download package and a straightforward installation. So once you've got that available, you'll then have the npm Node Package Manager available. And then you can head to the terminal and type in npm install and then the Vue CLI. So once you've got that running, you can try the Vue version, and that should tell you what version you've got available. And then from there, we can then start to actually install or create a new Vue application. So go ahead and complete these steps, installing Node and then install the Vue CLI. And then I'll see you in the next stage of creating a new Vue application. Okay, so assuming you've now installed the Vue CLI and Node, we can now go ahead and create a new project. So we're going to create Vue create, and then we're going to create a new project. Let's just call this Vue ML for machine learning. So go ahead and create that. So that's going to take a couple seconds to run. So just select the default settings here. And then that should now install everything you need and get your project ready to start building. Okay, so just another note for those who are comfortable with Vue. This is the final project, what it looks like. So we're using axios and roots, and we're creating a new view here called prediction. So if you are familiar with Vue, go ahead and create that setup and then skip ahead in the timeline. I'll show you how to set up axios. And then also we'll finish off with the prediction.vue. So for those who are completely new to Vue or want to follow the tutorial completely, let's now go ahead and create all these files and the code needed to build the front end to consume our Flask API. Okay, so now we've created our new project in Visual Studio Code. We open it up and you can see we've got an SRC folder. Inside of here, we've got some components and files. So the first thing we need to do is just remove the hello world. Let's just get rid of that. And then also in our app, we'll just remove the import. We don't need that. And this here, and we don't need this component. And we'll strip the style off too. So that's where we end up there. So there aren't any components. Okay, so there's nothing in the main that we need to take out. So now we're ready to start our application. So let's just take a second to remember what we're building here. This is our front end. So we're going to build an application which connects to our Flask server, consumes the API data. So we're going to send from our Vue application 13 parameters, the wine parameters. That's then going to be predicted utilizing the model that we created earlier, and the result is going to be sent back. So we need to handle that in Vue and then display that result on the page. So that's what we've got to do. So let's get started by building a few files. So we're going to need to use roots. So we're going to make a file called roots or router, whatever you prefer. So I'm going to call mine roots.js. Here we're going to define the routes. So the different paths into our program that will be available. So now we've got that in place, let's create a new file called axios. So this is a file that we're going to use to create, or we're going to use axios to create the connection to our API, our REST API. So we'll put that in there. We're going to need to install that in a minute. So with that in place, let's now install some of these packages that we're going to need. Actually, let's just finish off. Sorry, let's just make all the files first. So let's make a new folder. I'm going to call that views. So inside of this views are components that our routes are kind of connected to. So if we made a route to, for example, slash prediction, in this case, we're going to make a view here called prediction. So our route kind of sends the user to one of these components. So here we're going to make a new file called predictions or prediction. This is going to be a .vue file. So that's now in place. So yep, that is all the files that we're going to need for this project. So let's install some of the dependencies that we're going to need. So we can use the npm for this. So let's install bootstrap because we're going to need to use that. So we'll install that first. And then we go ahead and npm install the axios package. That's going to allow us REST API connectivity, or to generate connectivity for our REST API, our Flask API. So we'll install that. So that takes us a couple of seconds. I think that's all we need, except we also are using routes. So we're going to need to npm install and then vue-router. So that's now installed. So yep, that is all the packages that we're going to need. So now we can go ahead and configure. First of all, we configure Bootstrap. So probably the quickest way to get this working or incorporate Bootstrap, we've been a little bit lazy here, but we're just going to go to the main and import the bootstrap.min CSS. And now that's available within our project, and we'll utilize that just to make a simple front end configuration on our prediction.vue, just to make it look a little bit prettier. So what else are we going to need here? So let's start off by creating a new route. So we're going to make a new route to the prediction file. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing that we need to do is import from Vue. So that's just a mandatory. And then we need to import the router in. And then we're going to make a link to the prediction component. So we import that in like that. And so now that's all available. Now we're going to make sure that we're utilizing Vue, the vue-router in our Vue instance. And then we can go ahead and make a new route. So we'll do that. I'll just close that. So you can see here we've created a new route. So we're using mode history so that in the URL we aren't using hashes in the URL. It just makes things look a little bit prettier. And then the route, we're going to set up a route. So the default directory, the root directory, that's going to be called prediction. So we've got a named route here if we need it. And this is connected to this component that we're building. So here essentially is that when we navigate to this page, it's going to be utilizing this component inside of this views folder. So that's what we're saying there. So now in order to get that into our and fully integrate this router into our project, we go over to main. So head over to main. What we need to do here is import this router in. So we'll do that. So we import the router file. And now what we need to do finally is just put the router or get the router access or make it available within our new Vue instance when we actually build our project. Okay, so now that's configured. So this is probably a good time just to test and make sure that everything is working. So head over to the app. This is kind of an entry point to the application. So here we want to tell it that we're going to be utilizing router views so that when we navigate to one of the routes inside of our routes file, it's going to use this component here to display on the screen. So now we're utilizing the router view. So let's start our Vue server. So here we can type in npm and then run and serve. Now this isn't going to work, but just to show the fact that always forget to change the directory. So here we ran and created our Vue application, but we need to remember that inside of this folder here, we actually created our application. So if I do a directory here, you can see I've got my actual application called Vue ML. So I need to cd into that first. And then I can run the npm run serve. And that will then start the server. So we're given the URL for the server. Once that's loaded, you can see that it's one localhost, or the 192, the IP address of your machine, and port 8080. So let's go ahead and just open up a new tab. So we're going to be utilizing the localhost 8080, and there's nothing there at the moment. So this is a reactive package. So let's just go back into our app, if I can find the right window. And let's just create something on our prediction file. So here we're going to create a quick template, just so we can see something on the screen. So I just save that. Let's just head back into our server, and you can see it says hello. So everything is now connected nicely. So now we can move ahead and start to thinking about consuming our Flask API. Okay, so to build or make a connection to our API, we're utilizing Axios, which is a package that's going to allow us and provide all the facilities for us to make a API connection. So we need to configure this file. So in this file, we're going to basically import Axios, and then we're going to just create a simple base URL that we can utilize on all the different components in our system. So the whole point of creating a separate file for this is that this is a piece of code that we can reuse. So we define a base URL. So this is, if you remember, where the server is. Now, I might need to change that. I'm not too sure if that's 5000. I can't remember if it's using port 5000 Flask. So that's the base URL. That's where our API server resides. And we've got a timeout here of 1000. So that's basically going to time out. If the server isn't available, it's going to time out and tell you that it's timed out, indicating that the server isn't available. So with this information, we're just going to make this available within our application. So we export that and give it a name, get API. So that's the variable that we created. So now that's available within my project, and I'm going to extend from this, because if you remember, our API is actually residing here at this URL. So I'll extend that shortly. Okay, so now that's set up, the only thing that we've got left to do is to go into our prediction file here, our components, and now configure this. So this is probably the lengthiest part of this process. So I've gone ahead and created a template for this application. Now this is utilizing Bootstrap. You can see here deflex, flex column, justified content, etc. So what I'm doing here is I'm building a simple box element, and I'm just centering it on the page, and I'm giving it a height. Further along here, I've created a new class here. This is at the top. At the top here, we've got enter wind data to make prediction. That's in a H1 tag. Notice here that I've got a VIF. So if there isn't any data collected from the API, so I'm going to create a new variable in a second. Data component. If there's nothing inside of that, that means that it's going to show enter wind data to make prediction. Now, if I do get a result back from the API, then this is going to be removed, and else it's going to actually show you the result from the API. So that's what that component does there. Now here we've got a form. So this is the form that's got 13 different components, inputs. So I've just copied and pasted those out. And notice for each component, I've just provided a letter. So there's 13 letters in total. So notice here that we've got a letter here, and then what we're doing is we're passing this data to some data that we're going to set up in a second. Okay, so we've got 13 of those. So again, if you're interested in knowing what a label is, an input, just head over to Bootstrap, and that will give you some more guidance. But this is just copy and pasted from the Bootstrap template library, or the documentation. And at the end here, we got a submit button. So click equals predict. So we're going to send this data to a function called predict. Now, up the top here, if you're not familiar, we have submit prevent. So what that is basically if we don't include that, the page is going to try and submit the form. So we don't really want that. We want to actually submit the data to our function. So by adding submit prevent, it prevents the form from classically submitting or trying to submit, refresh the page. Instead, our data is going to be sent across to our function that we're going to be calling predict. So the rest here is just basic HTML with divs and form and so on. Okay, so now let's move to the bottom section, the functionality that's going to send the data across to our API, return it, and then give the information back to this top section here and display the actual API result. So I've pre-written the code. It would be interesting to know if you prefer me to pre-write the code or actually see me write the code. I'd be interested to know if that's more beneficial for you. But I've pre-written the code here. So first of all, at the end of the template, we created some script tags. And first of all, we're going to import the data from our page that we created, our axios.js, so we can access the two parameters, the base URL and the timeout. So we import that in. So we give this a name. Oh, we're just going to call this post. We can change that to just wine. And now we have some data. So we're returning the data from our inputs, from the user input, and we're just returning this data. Now, again, we could probably return this into an array, but just for you to easily see what's happening, we're returning that data to the corresponding labels here. So if we go back here, you can see this is sending it to the V model. We're using trim, so removing any white space. And then we're sending it to winedata.m. So this data is going to be stored in the winedata.m. I don't have an M. Okay. So I need to add an M here. L. M. Okay, so that's going to be stored right there. Okay, so hopefully you can see what's happening there. All the data that the user input is going to be stored here. So we also generate a symbol array here. This is for the results that's returned from our API. So we're going to store them there. And then that's going to be then be returned to the front end if we move up the top here. And it's going to be then placed right here at the top. Excuse me. Let me just zoom out and zoom in. So let's just go back to the top. So here we're going to check if you remember if there is any data, or if there isn't any data, sorry, it's going to say that. And if there is data, it's going to show the data from our API. Okay, so let's move back down. Apologies. Never good to see this, but let's move down to our method. So now let's make a new method. We're going to call this predict. Apologies. So here we're going to utilize our get API information from Axios, and we're going to extend it. So what we're saying here is we use that URL, and then we're going to extend it to /wine, because that's where our API is residing. So these are the parameters that we're going to send across to our API. So alcohol ash, these are all the properties of the wine. So these are essentially the variables that we're creating, and this is the data that we're sending across. So if you remember, the data gets stored into letters A to M. So this .wine data A, so the user's going to type in information, that data is going to go in here, and then that data then is going to be available right here to send across to our API. So we send the 13 parameters over to our API, and then we get a response. Okay, so we're going to log that, received data successfully. It's just to check if the data is coming in back or not. And then basically what we're going to do is we're going to get that data, this response.data, and we're going to put it into the actual variable that we created, API result. So all the data gets returned, and then we put it into the result, and that then goes into here, and then we can view it on the page, and so on. So that's pretty much it from here. That's all that we have in this file at the moment. Okay, so let's now start this server. Let's just make sure that it's running. So we run the npm run serve. We'll see if we've got any errors. Looks like we have some errors. So I'm in the wrong file here because I'm in Flask. So let's just open up the right. There we go. Okay, so our front end is running. which is all good. So that's the front end. Now I'm just going to flick across to Flask. So this is our Flask package. So let's just run Flask. Okay, so that was getting a little bit confusing. I've opened up a new window. This is where our Flask application resides. So what we need to do now, like I said, let's just run this. So if you remember, we're using the virtual environment and that's picked it up nicely. So now what we need to do is just run the Flask server. Okay, that was getting complicated. I've opened up a new window here for Visual Studio Code window, and you can see now I'm inside of Flask. This is our Flask file, and we're running the virtual server. So now we can go ahead and you may need to set Flask app again. So ml API.py. So now we can do a Flask run. So this is going to start the server. So just make sure you've got your model, your machine learning model in your Flask folder. So here we've got wind.pickle. I did rename it to wind.pickle. So that should correlate to line 9 here. So everything looks okay. It's running. Our server is 127001. So let's just check that. So back in my Vue application here, I'm just going to the axios. So that's where it's being served, which is great. And if you remember, the prediction is pointing to the /wine. So that's the directory where, or the URL it's expecting to find the API. So back in Flask, you can see that the route here is /wine, and we're using this URL. So let's go ahead and go to our Vue application. So this is what our Vue application looks like. So let's just type in some data and press submit, and you can see here that we're returning 1. So we are getting a return from our API, which is great. So if I press F12, you can see in our console it says receive data successfully. So we set that up and it says 1. So if you're wondering where that comes from, if you remember the response, we added console log received data successfully, and then we also console log the response data, which in this case we returned a wine class of 1. So what we can also do, of course, is just add to this some, if we wanted to call it class 1, etc., we could do that. So I wanted to give you a second example here using naive Bayes. So this is an example of using classification with binary labels. So here we've created some data manually. So you can see here that we have weather, temperature, and play. So this is the classic cricket situation scenario. The weather, the temperature depends on whether they're going to play or not. So you can add more data to this if you want to. So here we've got weather, sunny, temperature, hot, mild, or cool, and then play, no, or yes. So what we're going to do here is, and you can imagine this might extend to more parameters, we're going to create binary labels. So we're going to turn these parameters properties here into a 0, 1, etc., depending on how many properties there are. So if there's 3 properties here, we're going to see 0, 1, and 2, for example. So let's just first convert the string labels into numbers. So the first thing we do is we import something called pre-processing. So we're going to utilize pre-processing. Let me just zoom this in. And the first thing we do then is create a pre-processing label encoder, and we put that into a lab_n variable, and then we go ahead and encode the weather. So we take the weather data, we then convert that into binary labels. So you can see here when I print it out, we now have 2, which represents sunny. We've got 0, which represents overcast, and then the 1s represent rainy. Okay, so we do the same thing again with the temperature and the play. So same thing happens again, and I just outputted here the data that is returned. So once I've got that information, what I need to do is I need to take the weather and temperature and stitch it together. So I'm saying that sunny hot equals no, sunny hot equals no, and so on. So to do that, I'm combining the weather and temperature into a single list of tuples, and I'm utilizing feature equals zip. So I'm taking the weather encoded data and the temp encoded data, putting that together, and then I'm creating a features list. So features equals list features. So what I need to do here is I need to take this data and I need to convert that into a list. So I do that by utilizing the list function. I put the features inside, and what's returned now is this wonderful list of tuples here. So once we've got that in place, we can now go ahead and think about importing and dealing with this data to create our model. So from the sklearn naive Bayes, we import the Gaussian MB classifier. And so again, we make our, we put that classifier into a function here called model. And then what we're going to do is train this model. So we utilize the features. So the features were the weather and temperature. And then I also need the labels. So the labels correspond to the play data. So no or yes. So those are the labels. So with that data, and I put in the different numbers to correlate and to help you remember what the numbers refer to in the data. And now we can make a prediction. So we predict 2 and 1. So 2 sunny and then 1 hot. So we predict that and we get a prediction of 0. So 0 is no play. So we're saying here basically if it's sunny and if it's hot, 2 and 1, this is incorrect. If it's sunny and hot, then it's predicted that there is no play, no cricket play. Okay, so once we got that in place, we can now create another prediction. So that was just another exactly the same example of prediction. So, but once we've got that in place, we can now import that in. We can now import pandas so that we can create a pickle file of that model. So we take in model. So if you remember earlier, we fit the model here and we put it into the model variable. So we've got that in play now, and we convert that model into a file called cricketplay.pickle. Okay, so go ahead and run that. The file is in the repository, GitHub repository that's linked underneath the video here. So by all means, just take the data that you need, or if you want to run through that and type it out, then by all means do that. But go ahead, if you are going to take this file, you will need to actually run the whole thing. So go through the whole thing and run it. And then when it gets to the end, it will now have created the pickle file in the folder. So I'll just check mine, download folder, see if that's worked. So now I do have in my downloads folder, I have a file here called cricketplay.pickle. Okay, so that's the second model we're working with. So let's now go ahead to the server and the front end. We're going to make some different changes so that we can serve this data. Okay, so let's start off with the back end, the server. Let's just get this working. So we're going to make a few changes here. Let's just get rid of that. So we're not going to JSONify the data. Let's keep the request. We're still going to need the pickle, so let's utilize that. So we're going to keep this in place. So let's have a look at this. So we're not going to need all this data anymore, and we're not going to need that. So we'll get rid of the JSONify because we're just going to output, in this case, a number. So the outcome here is going to be a prediction of either 0 or 1, whether they should play or shouldn't play. So let's just make sure we've got enough parentheses there. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like. Let me just copy and paste this in. So from the user, we're going to collect 2 items. So the weather and the temperature. So the user is going to provide that data. It's going to send it across, and then we're going to collect that information. So we're going to request that from the get information, so the weather and the temperature, and put it in this variable weather and temperature. So then we just prepared the final features. So weather and temperature is going to be placed into a new prediction here. and then we get the results in prediction, and then we're just going to output them as a string. Okay, so that's what gets returned, either a 0 or a 1. Okay, so that's pretty much the changes that we need to make on the back end. So let's head now to the front end. So the front end is going to look very similar, the code. So again, we're utilizing the same format here, the Bootstrap framework, center aligning everything on the page. And this time we're utilizing a new header, and then we're going to use a vif. So if there is data returned, if there isn't data returned, sorry, not, then we're going to prepare some text here, enter weather details. And then if there is a velse data returned, then it's going to show the data. So the rest here, again, we create a form, submit prevent, and then this time we're going to use a select. So here the user is going to select from 3 options. So this is where we need to remember the numbering system for sunny, overcast, and rainy. So sunny represents 2 value, overcast 0, rainy 1. So when someone selects sunny, the number 2 is the actual value that gets sent across or saved, and so on. So the same is going to happen for hot, mild, and cool, the weather. So 1, 2, and 0 in this case. So those are the values that represent those. And now we can go ahead and obviously we're going to send this to the predict function. So we've got a button here to predict. Okay, so as per normal, we're going to get the axios information. This time we're going to send it across to a new URL called Cricket. So we're only taking in the weather and temperature here. So this is our data. And down here, the parameters that we're going to send across to our API is going to be obviously the weather and the temperature data. So this time we're going to receive a response, and it's going to be a 0 or a 1. So here we have a simple if statement here. So if the result that is returned is 0, so we put in the response data into a new variable called results, and then just doing an if statement. So result equals 0, that's no cricket today. And if the result equals 1, well, the else statement is going to take shape, and it's going to say it's good for cricket today. So that's how we're going to determine whether we should be playing cricket or not. So let's just now go ahead to our server, if we can find it. There we go. So everything is looking good to go, but let's just take a look back into the code. Let's just make sure that the server is running. So I had a few problems. I just went ahead and just checked everything. So something that I forgot to say was in your Flask application, you need to change the root to /cricket. So that's where we're consuming that information, and just make sure that the servers are running. So with that in mind, you can now head across to your Vue application. Select sunny and hot, for example, and there is no cricket today. So let's just find something that there is cricket. There we go. So if it's overcast and mild, it's likely that it's good for cricket today, and so on. So there we have it. So there's 2 applications using 2 models, 2 techniques to prepare data into a pickle file to then consume in an API, and then utilizing a Vue front end. Of course, you can change the front end to anything you like, really. And also the API and the model will work on Django or Flask, whatever you wish to utilize the model on. So there we have it. We've built 2 models using naive Bayes algorithms, and we built a Flask API to serve these models, and then we utilized a Vue front end application to consume and make new predictions. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this. If you've got any feedback, if you feel as though, like I said, the code, you prefer me to actually write the code or see the code in that way, I'd be interested to know if you prefer, or however you prefer the code presented. If you feel as though I haven't gone into enough detail on some sections, then please give me some guidance. If you need more in-depth information, and if the majority want more in-depth, then I'm happy to give you more in-depth information about different sections of it, parameters, and so on. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, like I said, and you've learned something from it. Please like and subscribe if you do like it, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.